Okie dokie. So, hello and welcome everybody to the spring quarter run of the basically introduction to the MCAT and some MCAT strategy courses, classes that I'm going to be running for the next 6 weeks, actually 7 weeks, because there's going to be a gap in there somewhere because I have to go away for a conference. So there's 1 week in the first week of May where we're going to skip a week and then we'll restart back up after. So my name is Doug McLemore. I am staff advisor and test prep specialist for the UC Davis HPA. And I've been working in test prep for close to 20-ish years now, 20, maybe longer, because I got started when I used to teach at Colorado State University, a different CSU that you guys are not used to. And so I just sort of thrown into it, had to figure out how to take the MCAT myself before I started teaching it to other people. And since then, I've worked for Print and Review and myself, and now Davis, doing MCAT prep and helping people understand how to get better at this thing. So let me get a gauge of who's taking the test when. Who's taking the test and when? Possibly July, end of August, August 31st, September. Okay, so you're all planning on basically sometime this summer. That's good. That's why this is a good time to be going through this. And if you know anybody else who's working on the MCAT, these are always good for them to come to as well, even if they're not taking it, say, till January, just because it never hurts to get a little bit of a jump on the MCAT. So today, our topic is just basically getting to know the cars section, what it's all about, and some of the tools, the scoring, the timing, and what you're expected to be doing in this section anyway. So without further ado, let's head on. So first, I like to talk about the structure of the MCAT, just so you understand what it is and how cars fits into it. So I think it's devious of them to put cars where it is. Chem Phys and cars are the two sections which most people would consider the hardest. Thankfully, they at least put them at the beginning of the test, but cars is the second section, which I think was done for a reason. They want you a little bit fatigued during the cars section. So you can see once you start the test, you do the Chem Phys section, you take a short break, then you do cars. And the cars section, which is what we're all about here today, is reading comprehension. So it takes a lot of focus. So why did they put it when you would have some of the least focus on the test? Because they want you to make mistakes. Like that's what standardized tests are created to do. They want you to be making mistakes so that they can distinguish you from other people with your score. Is it right? I don't know. Is it what we have to deal with? Yes. So do you understand that? And Psych Soc, for example, is also cleverly placed because it's the last section, simply because it's usually considered by most to be the easiest section. And so they want you as fatigued as possible for that one. They don't want to put cars there because they want you to do worse on the easier section, quote unquote. So these are things you must think about. And when you're practicing, think about these types of things as far as timing of practice. Doing practice cars questions in the evening, that's not a good model of how you're going to be feeling at the time. So when you're practicing and working on your MCAT, think about the time of day it's going to be. You're going to be just before, like, probably around 10:30 starting the section because you start the test at 8. And so you got that 95 minutes is an hour and a half, gets you to 9:30 plus 10 minutes. So more like 10 o'clock, you're going to be starting the cars section. So maybe you model that by practicing cars in the morning instead of practicing cars at night. So you have that best example of how you're going to be feeling at that time of day. You're not going to be as perky as you are first thing in the morning, or it might be better for certain people because if they're not an early riser, it might actually be better to have it later in the day. Who knows? So the positioning of the cars section is important to note, and it's important to get used to because it is literally the most fatiguing section. And then you get your lunch break right after. You go into biochem, you get another break, and you go to Psych Soc. All in, you're talking, this is an 8-hour day. So you get at the testing center at 7:30. You start the test at 8. if you get there at 7:30 and you start at 8, and then you're going to be done around 4-ish, maybe a little bit before, because of all the checking in and checking out and all the various sundry things. So that's just the test. That's not even counting your driving in and you're going home. Maybe you're at a hotel because you couldn't get a test site location very close to you. Like, how many of you are taking the test over an hour away from where you live? Nobody's got that? Oh, y'all got lucky. Close to it. Even sometimes when they're close to home, they could feel like they're an hour away just because of traffic, especially if you're in SoCal. So you've got to count that into it as well, because it's the time it takes to get the testing center is going to make a difference in how you're feeling. So think about those things when practicing. So any questions on the structure of the MCAT? We're going to spend a little more time on the structure next time when we're talking about science, because there's more to it. But any questions about the structure of the test? Or the overall structure? Okay. Now, what the heck is CARS? It's an abbreviation for this: the critical analysis and reasoning skills. Critical analysis and reasoning skills. So rather than having to say that mouthful over and over and over again, we just call it CARS. And actually, the AMC has now taken it up on themselves to call it CARS as well. They used to insist on typing out and reading out the entire name of this section all the time. But, you know, thankfully they got the hint that the name sucks. So CARS it is. There's 3 things, there's 3 skills that they say you need to know, and here's what they are. The first one, foundations of comprehension, is about a third of the questions. So about 15 or 16 questions on this section. Really, this is what I would refer to as retrieval task. This is a retrieval task. You need to be able to go to the text, find the information, retrieve it, answer a question with it. And when I say retrieval, I mean literally that. If the passage doesn't say it in any way, it can't be an answer to a question of this sort. So this first skill is that simpler task of just retrieving information. In fact, the need to read is very low on questions like this. What effectively these questions are is word search puzzles. You're looking for keywords to find the piece of information that you need to answer the question. And we're going to talk a lot about, like, should I be reading or should I not be reading this, the passages? And I fall on the side of, I think people read too much on the CARS section. I think you need to stop reading as much and start doing a little bit more comprehending. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. Like, reading is different than making meaning of something. So the second type of question is reasoning within the text questions. I like to think that these are structural questions. This is what I usually refer to these, because they're asking me, like, why did the author say something? How did the author say something? Like, what was the author's argument or main point? That type of information. And that's why I say they're structural. And I always also think of it this way: that the second skill requires the use of that first skill first, because you have to go find the thing that you're looking for, and then you have to understand, you have to figure out how it was written. And the how is written is going to tell you the answer to these types of questions. And we'll spend a whole session on just that, to look at how these things are written. And again, that's about 30% of the questions, or a third of the test, third of the section. The final type of skill that they're testing you on is reasoning beyond the text questions, which these are going to go one step even further. So while 2 includes 1, 3 includes both 1 and 2. So I need to do that retrieval task that 1 would tell me to do. I would need to figure out what the structure is and how the thing was written, what the main point is and all that, to go ahead and then answer these reason beyond the text questions, which I will call new information questions. These new information questions are going to bring something else from outside and say, how does this relate to what the author wrote? So I've got to find what the author wrote. I got to understand what the author wrote, and then I got to extend it beyond. So the first task is retrieval, the second task is structural, and the third task is relating to new information. And that's, you're going to hear me say those three things over and over and over again. Like, is this a 1, a 2, or a 3? Or I'm going to say, is this a retrieval or a structural or a new info type question? I know that there's other companies out there, like other companies. I'm not a company. I know there's companies out there that have like 12 or 15 or 20 different question styles or types of questions in cars. I think that's a lot of overkill. I think that's overthinking what has to happen to solve questions. Because if you just boil it down to those 3 tasks, because that's what the AMCAS or AMC said, they're saying, hey, folks, these are the 3 tasks we want you to know, 1, 2, and 3, then it jives better and it's easier to connect with how the test is structured. Now, they do mess me a little bit with the topics. So you're going to have passages from the humanities and you're going to have passages from the social sciences, and it's about 50-50 split. The tricky part is once in a while, you're going to see a passage that feels like psych-soc, because that's the social sciences, right? Once in a while, you're going to get that. That is a psych-soc looking passage. And you have to resist the urge to use your science, because they don't have to do the science correctly in the cars section. If the passage says in cars, the sky is pink and purple, what color is the sky? It's pink and purple. It is. It just has to be, because the cars passage said so. If I was in the psych-soc section or the sciences sections or any of those, if they say the sky is pink and purple, that would be really out of place, and I would still know the sky is actually blue. So they must be talking about some other concept, blah, 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 being on another planet or something like that. So what's all that to say? Never bring in outside information into this test. And I know that people have taught reading comprehension for years and said this phrase, and I really hate that they use this phrase, that reading comprehension is reading between the lines. It is absolutely not reading between the lines in my mind, because the second you start reading between the lines, what are you doing? Are you listening to the author anymore? Or are you listening to yourself now? You're starting to read between the lines. Are you listening to the author or yourself? Now you're listening to yourself, and that's not what you should be listening to. You should be listening to the author. Don't go straying between the lines. Authors generally, not all authors, but most authors are going to say what they want you to know. They're not going to hide it behind a wall of gobbledygook and make you try to tease it out. There's a very common or famous example of an author who totally took College Board, or maybe it was Star, I can't remember which one. It was in Texas. There was an author who sued this company that wrote this test that used one of their passages, or used a piece of one of their books or something like that, and they just completely misunderstood what the author was trying to say. And they said, why didn't you just ask me? I would have told you. So the author has a certain meaning, and they're trying not to hide it. And if you try to read too much below the surface, you will come up with some really weird stuff. So am I being very obnoxiously heavy-handed about saying this? Yes. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is reading too hard, reading beyond what the author is trying to say. So that's what the cars are. These are these skills that they expect you to have that contribute to your ability to understand what you're reading. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, timing. There's a couple things about timing we can look at, is like how much time per passage or how much time per question, all this kind of fun stuff. I'm just going to give you a few ways to give yourself some guidelines. Overall, the section has 9 passages in 90 minutes. So on average, how many minutes per passage should you be spending? 10 minutes. This is a good example of MCAT math. 90 divided by 9 is 10. So you got about 10 minutes per passage. That's not a lot of time. That's only when it's a 6-question passage, that's really spending like a minute and a half on each question. And then if I do that, what's 6 times 1.5? That's 9 minutes. That means I really only have like a minute to deal with the passage, to be reading it. And here's the problem. You don't have enough time to be reading and then rereading and then rereading and rereading and rereading the passage. Which is why I'm going to show you some techniques that you can use to minimize the number of times you go through the passage. In fact, most of the time, when people start to get into like cherry picking the passage and reading certain things before other certain things in order to answer questions, it means you're not going to have to go back and read a second time or a third time or a fourth time. Because, and I'm sure you've seen this happen. What happens when you read the passage first and then you go answer a question? What are you going to have to go do? You're going to have to go back and check anyway, which means you're probably going to read that paragraph again anyway. So all of a sudden, you've created this forced issue by reading it in detail up front that you're going to have to go back and do it again anyway. So now you're doubling the time you're reading. You don't get points for reading. What do you get points for? You get points for questions. You got to answer questions. You get with the right answer, and that's how you do it. And to some extent, that means you have to do less reading. And it's weird. Like, you hear me harping on you're reading too much or you need to do less reading. It seems basically counterintuitive on a section that's whole purpose and function is supposedly reading comprehension. But again, reading comprehension isn't actually just reading words. There's more to it than that. And you don't have to understand stuff. You don't have to read every single word of every single paragraph. So in the card section, you also have 5 question, 6 question, 7 question passages. The most frequent you're going to see are 6 question passages. There's going to be 1 7 question passage on the whole thing and a handful of 5s for a grand total of 53 questions. So if you don't want to go by just the generic 10 minutes per passage, if you want to like time it out, like try to be a little bit more careful with time, I would say don't spend more than 8.5 minutes on a 5 question passage, 10 minutes on a 6, and use 11.5 minutes for that 1 7 question passage. That's going to keep you going about the right amount of time and ending with like 2 or 3 minutes left if you stick to those numbers. What if you just can't get your score above a 125 or get it to a 128 in the cars? That's when we start talking about the 8 passage pace or maybe the 7 passage pace. If you take and just focus on 8 passages and do 8 passages really, really, really well, but then instead of trying to get that 9th passage done, just go C, 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 C for the hardest passage that you found, the one that has like the really convoluted language. For me, it's the Henry David Thoreau passage, if they want to throw one of those on there, because I can't understand a word that man writes or wrote. You can just go C, letter of the day, boom, 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 boom. You can get a 128 if you do really well on 8 passages and skip that last passage. Is it the way I want everybody to do it? No, but if you need to do something to get your car score to pop up, that's actually a good way to do it. Just focus on 8, skip that passage that you see that just scares the heebie-jeebies out of you, and then move on. So there's things we can try to help you, basically get that score to come up, which might mean don't answer every single question. You don't have to get all the questions right to get a good score. You just got to get a lot of the questions right to get a good score. It's less than most people think. Actually, if I asked this, a 512 on an MCAT, a 512, what percent of the questions correct do you think you need to have to get a 512 out of a 528 on an MCAT? Closer to 80%. It's a solid B minus C plus. You do not need to get an A on this test to get a 512 on the MCAT. You can be a solid B minus, C plus on there, and boom, you got your 512. It's not as simple as that, because every time you get another point, it gets harder to get that next point, because, you know, the questions are getting harder and blah, blah, blah. So, but in essence, it's like roughly about 80% correct and gets you that 512. It is probably lower than most of you are thinking, and it might be a surprise. I hope it's a surprise that you don't have to be doing as well as you think you have to do. You don't have to be perfect. You just got to be pretty good. Do well. Oops. So what are the tools that you get on this section? Let's talk about a keyboard for a minute. Most of y'all got laptops, I'm assuming, right? Laptops or tablets or something like that. You need to practice on one of these, a real keyboard. It doesn't have to be fancy and light up like mine does, but you need to get a keyboard for your computer that can plug into your computer, and a mouse, an external mouse. These are critical tools because that's what you're going to have in the testing center. And yes, the MCAT is on the computer. And so these are essential testing tools because you got to get used to how they work. Like using the touchpad for your mouse is so different than using the real mouse, because on the real mouse, you're going to have a scroll wheel and 2 buttons. And a lot of the tools are going to be easier to use because a lot of the highlighting strikeout is going to be easier to do because of that. It's difficult to use a touchpad, in fact. And the reason I say use an external keyboard is because the laptop keyboards are tiny, and plus they're like the buttons are very close together. You're going to have a harder time using it. You want to get used to how the keys are farther apart on the bigger keyboard, especially if you use the keyboard shortcuts on the left, which I would strongly encourage you to use. The highlight, the strikeout, the flag, the navigate, the previous, the next. A lot of what we talk about is skipping around in this test. It's a common strategy. And people always say, well, isn't that difficult to do? And absolutely not difficult to do at all. Alt-P, Alt-N, bam, 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 bam. If you just get used to using those keyboard shortcuts, then you're going to be able to jump around this test with the best of them. It doesn't take that much extra time to do the jumping around thing once you know how to use the shortcuts. So, and on a Mac keyboard, by the way, there's no Alt key, so you got to use that funky flower key, which I believe is referred to as the Command key. So Command H, Command S, Command F, etc. Another good reason, if you have a Mac, to get an external keyboard that is a normal standard keyboard, because your Mac keyboards are just a little bit different than the normal Windows keyboard. You're going to have an on-screen timer. You're going to have a scratch board with a marker, which we're going to be talking about ways to use that for cars. The scratch board is basically laminated cardstock, and the marker is a vis-a-vis whiteboard, or sorry, vis-a-vis, not whiteboard, but one of those overhead markers. So it's a wet erase marker. It is messy. Any lefties out there? Seems to always be one. Doesn't appear we have that one this year. But lefties, let them know this is going to be a very messy test for them, because the scratch board marker combo for lefties is just atrocious. They will provide, when asked, noise reduction headphones. I would suggest you don't use them. They are not actually electronic, so they're not noise canceling or anything. It's just basically those things that you see a street worker wearing, so they can muffle their ears and not go deaf from the jackhammer. And they are about as heavy as those that you see them wear, and they are not very effective. And they're honestly, if you're a small head, they fall off. If you're a big head, they hurt. So I would not try to use those. You can bring your own sealed foam earplugs. They have to be hermetically sealed in the plastic, just a pair. You can get those at the pharmacy, or I believe some of the testing centers have started providing them upon request. You just have to check with that testing center. I also suggest not to get used to that. The noise is not terrible in these things, and there's going to be distractions whether you can hear or not. There's going to be visual distractions. Most of the testing centers are set up so you're like in a small carrel with your computer here, but there's somebody like 4 feet to your right, 4 feet to your left. They're going to be getting up at different times because everybody's on a different schedule on the MCAT, because you take the breaks, you don't take the breaks. It's the first person in, first person to start. So there's always going to be this constant movement in the room. So you're going to have enough visual distraction already. The noise distraction, probably, you just want to get used to that. Which means, by the way, a good place to practice this test is actually in the library, like up in the stacks, second floor, third floor, where they have a little bit of noise and people walking around, but it's not like downstairs in the big room when you go left where everybody's just freaking screaming. that room is so loud. I don't know why people talk so loud in there. And then a mask. If you choose to wear a mask, you're allowed to wear a mask. You will be asked to display your mask like this. You'll hold it up, hold it this way, because they want to check to see if it's got any listening devices or anything like that in it. So they are not allowed to touch it. If they ask to touch it, you can say no. So these are the things you get in this car section. It's the same stuff you get in the science section, except you also have a periodic table that you can use in the science sections. Questions so far? All right. So let's talk a little about what reading comprehension is. So I went to the dictionary and got the ability to process text, understand its meaning, and to integrate with what the reader already knows. Reading comprehension. What really is reading comprehension, though? And there's some things that are very surprising that you've probably never been really brought in on the secret for when it comes to reading comprehension. Like, what word up there what out of those little words I put there on the left, are there any there that surprise you have to do with reading comprehension? Fluency. That seems like a strange one. Like, if I just know my vocab, shouldn't I be able to read? Not really, because knowing vocabulary is not the same thing as being fluent in stringing those words together, because you may see a word in a different context than you've ever seen it before. Or if you're not comfortable with the way it's written, if you're not fluent in written English to the point where you're comfortable, it's going to take you a really long time. And it's going to be more difficult to catch things like, how do they use that particular vocab word? Vocabulary, honestly, this is probably the single most important thing that most of you need to work on. I'm going to say most, because I'm betting somebody here as a substantial vocabulary. This is especially harmful for people that are ELs, English language learners. So you didn't have English as your early language. So you're still trying to figure out vocabulary. Vocabulary is so danged important to reading comprehension, because one of the most common things I see with people that struggle with cars is, I don't know that word, so I just skip it. Has that happened to you before? Like, I don't know that word, so I have to skip it. Yeah. And it's frustrating, and you got to do your best guess in that situation. But like, they're not going to ask vocab questions most of the time. Like, every once in a while, you'll see when this word most likely means or was used by the author to mean what. But if you are even just missing one word out of a sentence, it can dramatically compromise your ability to understand what that sentence is trying to say. So I want you all to start working on vocabulary. There's a vocab app for the GRE. I know there's not one for the MCAT, but the GRE has a pretty substantial vocabulary. If you go to the App Store, you can find the vocab app for GRE. That's all of a sudden the name is eluding me. Magoosh. The rest of Magoosh's apps, not good. But the Magoosh GRE app for vocabulary, good. Start practicing GRE vocabulary. Just do a little bit of practice with that every day. Start a vocabulary list for yourself. If you're just doing everyday stuff and you run into a word that you don't know, write it down a list and start trying to use that word. Because the more you can expand your vocabulary, the more fluent you become, the more recognition you can have of what's being said, the more you can decode. So that's how those three things go together. Vocabulary leads to fluency, or can help lead to fluency. Fluency helps your ability to decode what it is that you're seeing on the page. Sentence construction is a strange one too. Where they put the comma matters so very much. If I say this sentence, actually let me type it in the chat box. Does that sentence make sense? Okay, perfect sense. Does that sentence make sense? But does it make common sense? Does it make sense with what you should think? Right. It's like all of a sudden you get this image of a very violent panda. Like that, it makes no common sense. So just simply by moving the commas around or adding commas or putting a comma here or there can dramatically change the meaning of what you're reading. That's why it's so important to pay attention to punctuation. Like putting a comma somewhere might mean the difference between those two sentences, but the difference between the correct answer and the incorrect answer, honestly. And so I think we take grammar for granted, because every time you jump on a computer these days, what is Word and Google Sheets always trying, or Google Docs trying to do? Puts those little red squiggly lines under everything and says, here's the way you're supposed to punctuate it. So we don't think about punctuation anymore. The computers do it for us. So you got to start re-engaging with grade school, maybe a little bit, because that's when they taught you how to use these things. How many people have attention issues? This I think is the second biggest problem with cars, is attention span. And it's not short attention span that's the problem. It's being able to stay attuned for more than a couple minutes at a time on the same thing. And that becomes very difficult when you hate what you're reading. Like if you're reading into a passage about poetry, for me, reading a passage about poetry is about as exciting as watching paint dry. And I have a really hard time focusing my attention on it. And so therefore I'm missing out on what it's saying a lot of times, because my eyes start drifting. I'm like, God, this sucks. And like, that's the passage I know I should be skipping and waiting and leaving till last and just doing my good old college try on, is that one that I can't keep focused on. And you should actively try to understand what it is that does and does not keep your attention. But you can also work on this with the attention span. I want everybody to go find a book by an author you hate and a style of literature that you don't like, and I want you to read it a little bit every day, and a little bit more every day, and then a little bit more every day. Because I want you to start reading something that you absolutely don't care about and force yourself to get through it. Now, it seems strange. It seems like a waste of time. But what it will help you do is, if you create that task for yourself, you're going to get better at just forcing yourself to read things you don't want to read, that you're not interested in. So for some, that might be a fantasy novel. For some, that might be a Harlequin romance. For some, it might be a thriller or a mystery or whatever the kind of writing is that you just don't enjoy. Try reading it. Or some, maybe it's nonfiction. A history book for me is like, again, watching paint dry. So do whatever you can to work on that attention span. To get better at reading comprehension, also requires a little bit of this. And this also helps with the attention span. Because sometimes you don't need, like, focus is different than, like, being able to focus and do reading comprehension is different than just being able to stare and read at something for extended periods of time. It means you're doing these extra little tasks all throughout, where you're doing things as you go. Like, you stop and go, like, what the heck did that even mean? Like, huh? What is that? Or at the end of every paragraph, just checking in and going, like, what, okay, the main idea of this paragraph is this. Or what's the main idea of the text? Why did the author write it? What's the author's point? What's the author's attitude, belief, tone? Why is this transition here? Where are the transition words? Transition words are so important, by the way, because they end up leading you to answers. Like, almost every answer is where there's a transition word. Not every answer. I'd say, like, it happens like 80% of the time, though. Like, where you see a transition word, however, but, instead, also, those words are big flags going, hey, look at me over here. So watch, where are the transitions and what are they doing? What's the change in viewpoint? Where's the author talking versus where they're giving an example of somebody else talking? Listening to whose voice is present. That's what a good reading comprehension skill looks like, is not just reading. It's reading for a reason, having a point to what you're doing. If you're just going through the words, you're not understanding anything. So you got to slow yourself down to, like, pay attention to the detail, pay attention to that. Like, this word was never in there, therefore it doesn't say this. So being able to slow yourself down and not be super hyper focused actually helps with that attention span problem. Doing these other little tasks along the way and asking yourself, what's going on here? What did this say? Why did it say it this way? Etc. is going to be very helpful to fix that attention span issue. The more you can intersperse these tasks in, the quicker you get. So that's sort of my take on what CARS is. It's learning how to read differently than you probably already read. Because how many people would say that they already have a good strategy for reading in general for tests like this? I bet if I looked at all your browser histories, I would see CARS strategies as a search term. I would venture to guess that every one of you has probably done that at some point. What are the best CARS strategies? And have you come up with anything doing that? So I'll also say, when you do those things, like, that's one of the issues. A lot of these things, they're so techniqued out that the technique gets in the way. Like, when I say techniqued out, it's like, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3.4, step 3.6, step 3.74a. Like, there's so many convolutions in the what you're supposed to do thing. It takes more time than you have to do the passage. And so, but that's what, again, why I say some of these, like, just adding things like having multiple question types makes it much harder to get better, makes it much harder to improve. So that's why we want to sort of develop our reading into a different style and stop looking that stuff up on Reddit, because it ain't gonna help. I tell you, it's Reddit is just one of the worst places to go for advice on MCAT and med school in general. So delete the Reddit app. Don't go there. And also, by the way, there's this new kid on the block, ChatGPT. Have any of you tried it? It's fun to play around with, but it is not a study tool. It is definitely not a good study tool. I'm kind of transitioning over to maybe science a little too much here, but just to get it out there, ChatGPT gets things wrong. It is not foolproof. You can't trust it because what it's getting the information from is the internet. and there's a lot of false crap out there on the internet, and it doesn't know how to fact check. So I have a student right now who I've tried to kick the habit, but goes to Chat GPT for every question and says, explain Freud's theory, or they start looking all this stuff up and reading it, the paragraph that comes out, thinking it's valid. And I had to point out for like there was 2 chemistry questions, very wrong information. And so like you can't trust those things. Even if it's just doing a regular web search, you can't trust it. So be careful. Be a critical reader of the information you see on the internet. See what I did there? Wink, wink. All right. So, any questions?